What's the most brutal way you can imagine dying? Burned alive? Or maybe crucified? But Rome's richest man met an end far worse. This is the story of Marcus Licinius Crassus, the billionaire of ancient Rome, who got killed by his greed. Marcus Licinius Crassus had everything. He had wealth, power, influence, but it was not enough. He wanted glory, and he wanted to be remembered alongside Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great. And to get it, he led one of the largest Roman armies ever assembled into the deserts of Mesopotamia. And what followed was one of the greatest military disasters in Roman history. What does it mean to be the richest man in the richest city on earth? Marcus Licinius Crassus could answer that question better than anyone who lived in the 1st century BCE. He was Rome's walking treasury. Yes, a man whose fortune envied kingdoms, whose wealth could make any senator's act to his will, and whose purse strings can make anyone dance. But his fortune was not born of heroic conquest, like Julius Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, nor from naval victories, like Pompey's triumphs over pirates and kings. Crassus's empire was built in the shadows and in the misery of others. He was a clever, ruthless businessman. When Rome burned, he sent his private brigades of slaves, not to save others, but to wait until those desperate people begged for rescue. Only then would he step forward with his offer, and that is to sell the property to him at the lowest price, or to let it turn to ashes. He watched the neighborhood's ruin so that he could take control over it and take the entire districts under his name. Beyond real estate, his wealth grew through human suffering. He purchased slaves and made them work to exhaustion in mines and quarries. He trained them as laborers and sold them again at vast profit. All that money he earned had the smell of blood in it. To his enemies, he was a vulture circling Rome's misfortunes. To his allies, he was a bottomless bank whose gold could fund armies and buy kingdoms. But to himself, he was something greater, a man destined not only for wealth, but for glory. In Rome, coins alone did not make a legend. It was the battlefields what made them immortal. By that time, Caesar had forged his name in Gaul, and Pompey had taken control of the seas, securing Rome's dominance across the Mediterranean. And Crassus? He was called the third wheel of the triumvirate, a man of money among warriors. At 60 years old, most men would have retired to enjoy their villas and their wine, but not Crassus. He refused to be remembered as a banker in the shadows. He wanted glory, and he wanted conquest. And beyond Rome's eastern frontier, he saw his chance. To the east of Rome stretched a land that seemed like a dream for Crassus. It was the Parthian Empire, which was vast, rich, and powerful. It controlled the trade routes that carried silk, spices, and treasures from the east to the west. To Romans, Parthia was like a giant chest of gold waiting to be opened. Crassus convinced himself that conquering Parthia would give him everything he wanted. He will get the military glory that he craved for, the eternal fame that he dreamed of, and of course, even more wealth. Enough silver and gold to make his already massive fortune look small. But more than anything, it would put him on the same level as Caesar and Pompey. If they had their triumphs, then so would he, and this one would outshine them all at once. There was one problem, and that was the Senate. Worried of Crassus's hunger for power, they refused to give him the official declaration of war, but Crassus didn't care, and he didn't need their blessing. In 55 BCE, he marched east as governor of Syria, determined to write his own destiny. Once there, he began to raise a massive army. He poured his money into it, recruiting more men than Rome had ever sent so far east. 7 legions of infantry, and nearly 40,000 soldiers with 4,000 cavalry, thousands more light troops, and it was a force so large that many believed Parthia would collapse at the very sight of it. Crassus's pride grew even greater because his son, Publius, joined the campaign. Publius was already respected in Rome because had fought bravely under Caesar in Gaul and was known as a skilled young officer. To Crassus, the presence of his son made the campaign more than just a conquest, but the beginning of a family legacy. Father and son would lead Rome to victory, and their names would live forever. Confident in his power, Crassus ignored those warnings. Local commanders who knew the desert well tried to warn him. They told him Parthia was not like other enemies, that their open sands were dangerous, and that Roman strategy might fail there. But Crassus dismissed those commanders, saying they were cowards. Rome had crushed every kingdom before, and why should Parthia be any different, he thought. With his legions ready, Crassus gave the order. In the spring of 53 BCE, the Roman army crossed the Euphrates River, and the invasion had just begun. For Crassus, the golden prize was finally within his sight. At first, everything went exactly as Crassus expected. His massive army crossed the Euphrates in the spring of 53 BCE and marched into Mesopotamia with their banners high. Town after town fell in front of Crassus with little resistance. Some surrendered immediately, and others were taken with ease. It looked like Parthia was weak, or maybe even broken. But the truth was very different. The Parthians were not fleeing out of fear. They were trapping Crassus deeper into their land. The farther the Romans marched, the more vulnerable they became. Supplies had to be dragged across the endless desert, and water grew scarce. The scorching sun was too much for the men in heavy armor to take. Then came the shadows. Parthian scouts appeared on distant hills just long enough to terrify the Romans before vanishing again. At night, strange sounds kept soldiers awake while hearing hoofbeats in the dark and whispers in the sand. Convoys carrying food and water were ambushed where arrows struck from nowhere. The enemy was invisible, untouchable, and everywhere at once. Roman discipline was strong, but even the toughest were not built for this kind of war. In forests and fields, in sieges and pitched battles, Rome was unstoppable. But in the open desert, against an enemy who refused to fight directly, the Roman army felt helpless. The Parthians were masters of mobility. Their heavy cavalry, called cataphracts, could smash through enemy lines like thunder. Their horse archers were faster and lighter, and they could circle first while firing arrows from large distances. They could even vanish before the Romans could strike back. Against this style of warfare, Romans struggled. Still, Crassus pushed forward, convinced that eventually the Parthians would be forced into a battle. That was the Roman way, where they find the enemy, crush them head-on, and claim victory. What he didn't realize was that the Parthians had no intention of fighting on his terms. They were bleeding him dry, day by day and step by step. By the time the Romans reached the city of Carrhae, Crassus's men were exhausted, thirsty, and nervous. But Crassus believed the moment he had been waiting for had finally come. He was informed that the main Parthian force was near, and he thought a great battle would win him the glory he craved. He could not see that he had already walked into a trap from which there was no escape. The day of truth came in June of 53 BCE, on the wide and open plains near the city of Carrhae. Crassus finally faced what he thought was the main Parthian army. His legions formed their battle lines with shields locked, standards raised, and ready to crush the enemy in a single fight. But what stood before them was not a massive army. It was a small force of about 10,000 Parthian cavalry under a general named Surena. To the Romans, it looked like a joke. Crassus had nearly 40,000 soldiers. How could such a small force stand against them? His army advanced with confidence. Then the desert exploded. The Parthians unleashed a storm of arrows, and thousands of horse archers rode in wide circles around the Roman formations, firing without pause. The Romans raised their shields in the tortoise formation, but the arrows rained down so fast, cutting down men and breaking Crassus's army in split seconds. Still, the Romans endured, and they expected the Parthians to run out of arrows. But they didn't. Behind the lines, camels loaded with fresh supplies were coming and keeping them strong. The Romans finally realized that this storm would never stop. Desperate to break the assault, Crassus sent his son Publius with 6,000 cavalry and infantry to charge the archers. At first, it looked like a success, but the Parthians retreated and the Romans chased. But it was a trick. The horse archers led Publius straight into an ambush. Heavy Parthian cataphracts slammed into his men while archers circled and fired. Surrounded by Parthian, Publius fought bravely until the end, but he and nearly all his men were slaughtered mercilessly. When the Parthians returned to the battlefield, they carried Publius's head on a spear. They threw it toward the Roman lines, and that sight broke the spirit of Crassus's army. By nightfall, thousands of Romans lay dead on the sand, and the survivors fled in chaos toward Carrhae. The great Roman war machine, which was feared across the world, had been humiliated by a smaller and faster enemy who fought on their own terms. Crassus's dream of glory was finally coming to an end, but his nightmare was only beginning. Night fell over the desert, but for the Romans, there was no rest. They were exhausted, thirsty, and broken. But still they tried to retreat under cover of darkness. Crassus hoped to reach the safety of Carrhae's walls, but his army was in chaos, where their discipline was gone in panic. Men threw away shields and armor just to move faster. Others collapsed in the sand, too weak to go on, left behind by their comrades. The Parthians did not chase in full force. They didn't need to. Their arrows, their ambushes, and their terror tactics had already done the job. Every mile of desert felt like a death trap for the Romans. Scouts of Parthia appeared on distant ridges, taunting the Romans, and then they vanished again. Fear was spreading with every shadow. By dawn, the survivors reached Carrhae, starving and broken. But even here, they were not safe, and the city could not protect them for long. Parthian horsemen surrounded the area. By that time, the desert became a prison, and the Romans were trapped inside it. Crassus still hoped to fight over something. He tried to rally the men, to promise that Rome would send reinforcements, but no one believed him anymore. They had seen his son die, and they had watched their legions cut to pieces. Now his words carried no weight for them. The Parthian general, Surena, then made his move. He sent envoys under a flag of truce. They offered peace talks, an honorable chance for Crassus and his men to withdraw if he would meet and negotiate. Some Roman officers smelled a trap, and they begged Crassus not to go. But he was desperate, and he needed a way out, a chance to save at least part of his army, a chance to avoid complete disgrace. So against all warnings, he agreed to meet Surena. The two sides met on neutral ground. What exactly happened next is debated. Some say the talks broke down and violence erupted. Others say it was betrayal from the start. What is certain is that Crassus and his officers were seized. The richest man in Rome, the great conqueror who had marched into the east with dreams of glory, was now a prisoner of the Parthians. But his suffering was not over. Surena had a punishment in mind that would echo through history. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, was now nothing more than a captive. His army was shattered, his son was dead, and his reputation lay in ruins. For the Parthians, this was not just about punishing a defeated enemy. It was about sending a message across the world. Rome's greed had crossed into their lands, and now that greed would be repaid in the cruelest way possible. The Parthian general Surena did not see Crassus as a warrior who deserved an honorable death. He saw him as a man who is blind in wealth and crazy by ambition, and his end would be a reflection of the life he had lived. Gold, the very thing Crassus had worshipped his entire life, would become his executioner, General Surena decided. The Parthians brought out a bowl of molten gold, glowing and deadly, heated until it burned like liquid fire. Crassus was held down, his mouth forced open, with no speeches, no last words. Slowly they poured the molten metal down his throat. The pain was beyond imagination. The gold seared through his mouth, burned down his throat, and burned through his body. In that moment, the man who had built an empire of riches learned the true cost of greed. He had dreamed of glory, but instead he became a living symbol or a warning carved into history. The Parthians were not finished. They took his head and sent it back as a trophy, mocking Rome and its failed ambitions. Back in Rome, the news sent shock through the Republic. The myth of Rome had lost not only its richest man, but also one of its three most powerful leaders. Roman dominance was finally shattered. Caesar and Pompey, once uneasy allies of Crassus, would soon turn on each other in civil war. In death, Crassus had set the stage for the fall of the republic he had once wished to dominate. The disaster at Carrhae was more than just a military defeat, it was a humiliation, one that showed Rome was not untouchable. For the first time in generations, an enemy had destroyed a Roman army completely in the most brutal way possible. And Marcus Licinius Crassus, the wealthiest man in Rome, became remembered not for his riches, but for the golden fire that ended his life. For the Parthians, the victory was celebrated for centuries. They had shown the world that Rome, the unstoppable empire, could be defeated. The story of molten gold poured down Crassus's throat became legend, passed from one generation to the next as a warning about greed and arrogance. And for history, it left a lesson that has never faded. Marcus Licinius Crassus had everything: power, money, influence. But it was not enough. He wanted more. He wanted glory to match his wealth. And in chasing that dream, he lost it all. His name is not remembered for the fortune he built or the deals he made, but for the horrific way he died. The richest man in Rome became the poorest in death. Even today, his story whispers a warning: the hunger for more power, more wealth, more glory can turn against you. Crassus thought gold made him strong. In the end, gold was the very thing that destroyed him. Now comes the real question. If you were Crassus, would you stop at riches or risk everything for a legacy? Let me know in the comments. Do like the video and subscribe for more horrific stories like Crassus's.